agree.
And we're not going to put up with it.
At 77, Sergeant Slaughter looks back on his career with a level of honesty that only comes with age. When he talks about the wrestlers he hated the most, he is not speaking about personal anger or private grudges. In wrestling, hate is something very different. It comes from political pressure, from booking decisions that put you in a corner, from battles over the spotlight, and from locker room conflicts that never truly stay behind the curtain. His entire journey through the 80s and 90s was shaped by these unseen wars. Slaughter became famous as the strict military figure, the drill sergeant who demanded control and discipline. But that same character made every backstage disagreement feel more intense. During the height of Hulkamania, everyone was fighting for the same top card position. The competition was fierce, and Slaughter ran into more than a few men whose ambitions collided with his own. To him, hate was simple. It appeared when someone was pushed harder than their talent earned. It showed up when the booking forced him to carry political heat that no one else wanted. It surfaced when a partner was unsafe and made a match harder than it had to be. Tonight, he is finally ready to reveal the 5 wrestlers he hated the most. Number 5. Roddy Piper was the kind of opponent who made every match feel like a test of control. From the outside, fans loved his wild energy and unpredictable style, but inside the ring, that same unpredictability created real tension. Sergeant Slaughter respected Piper's star power, but working with him was never simple. Piper did not follow a strict structure. He liked to improvise. He liked to push boundaries. And when you are in the ring with someone who refuses to stay within the plan, every second becomes a challenge to keep the match on track. Slaughter came from a background that valued discipline and order, and Piper thrived in chaos. That alone put them at odds the moment the bell rang. Outside the ring, the differences continued. Piper believed the business grew stronger when you broke patterns and surprised people. Slaughter believed the business stayed alive when everyone understood the structure. When the two mindsets collided, the room changed. Arguments over match direction, over who called what, over when to shift momentum became common. None of it was personal, but all of it created a pressure that Slaughter carried into each performance. There were nights when Piper's spontaneity brought the crowd to its feet, and there were nights when it nearly derailed the entire match. One moment Slaughter never forgot happened during a mid-80s loop. They had a clear plan for the opening sequence, and Piper suddenly changed it without warning. He threw a strike earlier than expected, forcing Slaughter to adjust mid-movement. It was not a dangerous moment, but it was one that shook the rhythm of the match. Slaughter remembered thinking how easily that kind of unpredictability could turn into something worse. Wrestling is built on trust. When a man changes the plan on the fly, you are no longer working together. You are trying to make sure nothing breaks. Piper would say he was doing it to keep the crowd invested. Slaughter saw it differently. To him, it added risk without purpose and created a level of tension that did not need to exist. Piper also had a habit of leaning heavily into verbal exchanges in the ring, pushing emotional beats harder than agreed. Slaughter knew the audience loved it, but backstage it often led to conversations about tone control and staying aligned. Those conversations rarely ended cleanly. Despite all the friction, Slaughter acknowledged Piper's talent. He knew Piper could elevate a match instantly. But that did not erase the difficulty of working with him. Hate in this context did not mean personal dislike. It meant the stress that came from facing a man who made every second unpredictable. Piper was a storm, and Slaughter was a soldier trying to hold the line. In the end, Slaughter's truth was simple. Piper kept him guessing. Piper disrupted structure. Piper turned every match into a negotiation. And that alone made him one of the wrestlers, Sergeant Slaughter hated working with the most. Number 4. Working with the Iron Sheik was never a quiet experience. He brought energy everywhere he went, and most of the time that energy turned into noise, tension, and pressure. Sergeant Slaughter understood that Sheik was a natural heat magnet. Fans reacted to him the moment he opened his mouth. Promoters loved that. But inside the ring and inside the locker room, that same intensity created real conflict. Sheik pushed every limit. He cut promos that sometimes went far beyond the script. He used language that made angles hotter than planned. And when things got too hot, it was usually Slaughter who had to carry the weight, especially during politically charged storylines. Their relationship outside the ring was complicated. There were days when Sheik showed respect and worked clean. There were other days when he walked in with his volume already turned to maximum. He had a habit of speaking his mind even when the moment called for subtlety. When tempers were high, Sheik pushed higher. When stakes were heavy, he made them heavier. Slaughter came from a mindset built on discipline. He wanted clarity, structure, and a plan everyone could trust. Sheik operated on instinct and emotion. Those two approaches crashed together more than once. Inside the ring, Sheik was strong, powerful, and sometimes too physical. Slaughter remembers matches where the first lockup felt like a test rather than cooperation. Sheik liked to set the tone early. He grabbed tighter, drove harder, and leaned into transitions, with force that blurred the line between working and fighting. There was a boot camp-style match that stayed in Slaughter's memory for years. Sheik threw a gut shot with so much pressure that Slaughter immediately realized the rest of the match was going to be a battle to keep control. Not unsafe enough to stop, but stiff enough to make every movement feel like walking on ice. Sheik also had a tendency to extend promos far past their agreed length. There was a night when a segment was scheduled for a few minutes. Sheik kept talking, adding digs, adding emotion, adding political lines that were never discussed beforehand. The crowd reacted, but backstage, Slaughter knew exactly what was coming. Management blamed the segment for stirring heat that should have been handled carefully. And once again, Slaughter was the one put in the position of smoothing the fallout. Moments like that created a resentment that grew over time. Despite all the friction, Slaughter recognized that Sheik was committed to his character. He never dialed back. He never played small. But commitment without control creates problems, and for Slaughter, that became the definition of hate in this case. Sheik was unpredictable. Sheik was intense in ways that sometimes made the work harder, not better. And when Slaughter looks back, he sees a man who challenged him not only in the ring but in every direction surrounding it. That is why the Iron Sheik stands as one of the wrestlers he hated working with the most. Number 3. The Ultimate Warrior was a force that could not be controlled. That was the first thing Sergeant Slaughter learned the moment he stepped into the ring with him. Warrior moved at a speed that ignored rhythm, pacing, and every structure that wrestlers rely on to stay safe. Fans saw the paint, the energy, the shaking ropes, and the explosive entrance. Slaughter saw something different. He saw a man who could turn a match into chaos with one mistimed step. That was the source of the hate. Not emotion, not jealousy, but the pressure created when you never knew if your opponent would follow the plan or break it without warning. Outside the ring, their relationship carried the same tension. Warrior trained like a machine, but he did not believe in slowing down for anyone. Slaughter came from an era that valued working smart, protecting your partner and making sure every movement counted. Warrior believed the crowd wanted intensity above all else. That created a divide. There were nights when Warrior was locked in and everything flowed. There were other nights when he sped so far past the structure that Slaughter felt like he was trying to catch a runaway train. Conversations after matches often felt one-sided. Slaughter pointed out missed cues and dangerous moments. Warrior brushed them off as part of his style. One loop in early 1991 left a deep mark on Slaughter. It happened during a series of matches while Warrior was still at his peak. They had rehearsed the opening, a simple sequence meant to set the tone. The bell rang, Warrior hit the ropes at full speed, and launched a shoulder tackle before Slaughter had fully reset. The impact threw the timing off and nearly turned the next spot into a disaster. Slaughter managed to adjust, but the moment confirmed something he had suspected for months. Warrior was not trying to hurt him, but Warrior was not thinking about him either. He was thinking only about the energy he wanted the crowd to feel. In wrestling, that mindset can be dangerous. Warrior also had a reputation for no selling when emotions ran high. Slaughter saw it firsthand. There was a match where a key strike was supposed to shift momentum. Warrior popped up instantly, signaling to the crowd instead of following the beat they had agreed on. The audience loved it. Slaughter felt the entire match tilt sideways. When one man stops cooperating, the story falls apart. And when the story falls apart, trust dissolves. Looking back, Slaughter does not deny Warrior's star power. He knows Warrior could electrify an arena like few others. But that same electricity made him unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of safety. Warrior made matches louder, but also riskier. He forced Slaughter to stay in defense mode, constantly adjusting, constantly protecting the match, and sometimes protecting himself. That is why Ultimate Warrior stands as one of the wrestlers Sergeant Slaughter hated working with the most. Number 2. Sid Justice was the kind of presence that changed the atmosphere the moment he walked into a room. He was big, confident, and convinced that he was meant for the top. Sergeant Slaughter had worked with men who carried ego before, but Sid's ego was different. It was sharper, louder, and paired with a habit that made every wrestler uneasy. Sid did not always sell. He did not always follow direction. He believed his size alone could carry a match, and that belief created one of the deepest tensions Slaughter ever felt in the ring. Outside the ring, Sid carried himself like a man who expected the spotlight to follow him. He often spoke about main events, title runs, and recognition as if they were owed to him. Slaughter respected ambition. What he hated was the lack of discipline that followed it. Sid would nod during match planning, agree to the structure, then step into the ring and do whatever he felt in the moment. That lack of consistency forced Slaughter to stay on alert every second. A match is built on trust. When one man breaks that trust, both men are at risk. One night in the early 90s proved exactly how fragile the situation could be. They had discussed a sequence involving a powerbomb, a move that required precision from both wrestlers. Sid was supposed to wait for Slaughter's cue before lifting. Instead, he picked him up early, shifting Slaughter's body before he had control. The landing was not disastrous, but it sent a shock through Slaughter's back that stayed with him for weeks. After the match, Slaughter confronted Sid, asking why he rushed the movement. Sid shrugged it off as instinct. That answer stayed with Slaughter longer than the pain. Instinct is not an excuse when another man's safety is in your hands. Sid also had a tendency to no-sell at the worst possible moments. Slaughter remembered a match where a turning point punch was designed to bring the crowd down and set up a comeback. Sid barely reacted. He stood tall, stared directly at Slaughter, and walked forward as if nothing had touched him. The crowd loved the moment because it made Sid look unstoppable. But for Slaughter, it broke the rhythm and forced him to restructure the entire second half of the match on the fly. Moments like that do not just ruin storytelling. They damage trust between performers. Slaughter admitted that Sid had presence. He admitted Sid looked like a man built for main events. But presence means nothing without control. A match cannot survive when one man refuses to cooperate. Slaughter never hated Sid as a person. He hated the unpredictability. He hated the feeling that any move could go wrong because Sid did not follow the plan. He hated carrying the responsibility of keeping things safe when the other man was not doing his part. And that is why Sid Justice stands as one of the wrestlers Sergeant Slaughter hated working with the most. Number 1. Hulk Hogan was not just another opponent. He was the system. That is the first truth Sergeant Slaughter understood when their careers collided. Working with Hogan meant stepping into a world where the spotlight moved only one direction and everything around it bent to support that light. Slaughter did not hate Hogan as a man. He hated what came with him. The politics, the pressure, the expectations, and the sense that no matter how hard you worked, the story would always return to Hogan. That weight created a level of tension that shaped Slaughter's entire experience during the height of Hulkamania. Outside the ring, Hogan was friendly enough, but every conversation circled back to the same reality. He was the top draw, the center of the company, and the man whose presence dictated every major decision. Slaughter respected that position. What he hated was the imbalance it caused. When a storyline involved Hogan, the margin for error disappeared. Promoters expected perfection. Media focused on every detail. Fans demanded intensity. And when something went wrong, it was rarely Hogan who carried the blame. It was whoever stood across from him. We have a 97. We have a 9. We have a 97. We have a 9. 10 BFR. We have a 9. 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 The clearest example came during their controversial program leading into WrestleMania 7. The angle drew heat far beyond what anyone predicted. Slaughter was instructed to push political themes that made him the most hated heel in the country. Hogan was framed as the patriotic savior. The story worked for television, but the pressure behind the scenes was overwhelming. Slaughter received threats, hate mail, and backlash that stretched far outside wrestling. During that time, Hogan remained insulated by his star status, while Slaughter absorbed the fallout. That imbalance fed a resentment that never fully left him. In the ring, Hogan was safe, strong, and predictable, but working with him carried a different challenge. The crowd belonged to Hogan before the match even began. Slaughter had to fight not only an opponent, but an entire wave of audience momentum. There were times when they planned sequences designed to give Slaughter control only for the crowd to react so loudly for Hogan that the timing shifted. Slaughter had to adjust change pacing and reshape the story to keep the match believable. It was not sabotage. It was the reality of wrestling with someone whose aura swallowed the room. After WrestleMania 7, Slaughter looked back and saw how much the rivalry had taken from him. The heat, the scrutiny, the responsibility, and the pressure all converged because Hogan was at the center. Hogan did his job. Slaughter did his. But the cost was heavier on one side. That is where the hate came from. Not anger. Not jealousy. The simple truth that working with Hogan meant carrying a burden no one else had to shoulder. And that is why Hulk Hogan stands at the top of the list of wrestlers Sergeant Slaughter hated working with the most. Looking back at all 5 names, Sergeant Slaughter sees a pattern that he could not recognize when he was living through it. Roddy Piper challenged his structure. The Iron Sheik challenged his patience. The Ultimate Warrior challenged his safety. Sid Justice challenged his trust. And Hulk Hogan challenged the entire balance of the business around him. Each man represented a different kind of pressure, a different kind of chaos, and a different kind of fight that went far beyond the matches they shared. None of it was personal. All of it was professional. But professional pressure has a way of shaping a man more deeply than private emotion ever could. Slaughter now understands that hate in wrestling is not about anger. It is about weight. It is about the nights when the audience expects perfection while the locker room is divided. It is about stepping into the ring with someone unpredictable, or someone protected, or someone who forces you to carry more than your share. Those pressures carve themselves into memory. They stay long after the bruises fade and the cheers disappear. When Slaughter speaks of hate, he speaks of the strain that tested his discipline, his control, and his presence under the brightest lights. At 77, he views those conflicts with clarity. They hardened him. They defined him. They pushed him into performances that might never have existed without the tension surrounding them. Every clash had a purpose, even if that purpose was invisible at the time. And in the end, these 5 men shaped his career as much as any victory storyline or championship ever could. Now the question turns to you. If you grew up watching that era, who would be on your list of the wrestlers you think created the toughest battles?